Good morning. Well, today's lectionary passage takes us to Genesis chapter 22. And I have to tell you right from the beginning, it's one of the most challenging passages of scripture for me to understand, to find the real meat and the meaning within these passages. Well, just prior to that, God had made a promise to Abraham. God had made a covenant with Abraham and said that he and his wife Sarah would have a child in their old age and that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And God was faithful. God granted Abraham and Sarah a child, and he was named Isaac. And that brings us now to Genesis chapter 22, when God says, Abraham, I'm going to have you go up to this mountain and I'm going to have you make a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is going to be your son, Isaac, who at this point now is maybe a young teenager. And Abraham is obedient. Abraham says, okay. And so Abraham and Isaac set out and they head up this mountain and they're preparing to make a sacrifice. And Isaac is asking his dad, where's the animal? Why aren't we taking an animal with us to sacrifice? And it dawns on Isaac that the sacrifice is going to be him. And so Abraham is being faithful. And now Isaac is being faithful as well. Isaac is willingly living out faithfulness in what God has called them to do. And then we discover at the very last second that God too is faithful. God allows a ram to appear in the thicket and he says, wait, hold on. Use this ram as your sacrifice, not your son Isaac. It's an amazing story. It's so hard for me as a parent to wrap my head around it and to understand it. But the lesson, the takeaway for me is the faithfulness that God called them to do, something that was very hard, very challenging, yet they were faithful in doing what God called them to do. We have a ladies' book club that meets once a month. We read a different book each month. And this month we have been reading Kisses from Katie. And I have so enjoyed reading this book the last couple of days about this sweet 18-year-old girl who, instead of choosing the traditional path of college and career and marriage and family, she instead goes on a short-term mission trip to Uganda. And that short-term mission trip turns into her life's calling. She falls in love with the people there. She falls in love with the children. She ends up adopting more than a dozen girls in Uganda. And she's there now. Her ministry continues. But what an amazing story of her faithfulness to do something so very hard, so very unlikely in today's society, that she would just move across the world and create a home in a third world country and to make a difference in individuals' lives because of her love for God and the way she is living that out. Well, I don't know that God is going to call us, any of us, to move to Uganda and adopt a dozen children. I don't know that God is going to call us to do something like he asked Abraham and Isaac to do, but I do know that God calls us to do things that are hard, things that we have never done before, things that he asks us to be faithful in, to follow through with. Yesterday, Steve shared in his devotional message about hearing the voice of God, listening for the voice of God. And I want to echo that today. Listen for God's calling in your life and be ready to be obedient, to be willingly faithful to what God is calling you to do. You might be surprised at the result, the way God turns up, and the way God is faithful as well.